Hello and welcome back to the Metro Wall Grid. My name is Andre. Thanks so much for tuning in. Today we have 7 tips to help improve yourself at Netrunner. These are some tips that I put together that I'm very excited to share with newer players, the sort of things that I wish I heard when I started the game. I know there's a lot of newer players entering this game recently because of the release of System Gateway, and I hope these are the sort of tips that might push you in the right direction to help you start making a bit better decisions and understanding why certain decisions should be made within a game of Netrunner. On top of that, of course, I've been playing this game for a while, and I find these tips still to be very relevant. So if you've been playing this game for a while, there still might be something here for you to maybe think about or better yourself. There's a lot of tips here that I should be following a bit more when I'm playing on the regular, so hopefully there's something for everyone. With all that, let's jump into our first tip, and our first tip is, in theory, pretty simple, but is actually very, very important, and that is simply the idea of planning your turn. And that sounds like a really daunting idea. What do you mean plan your turn? I don't know even what I'm doing. I'm just reacting, but let's boil it down to one single sentence. Plan all of your clicks before you spend any of your clicks. Now, the game of Netrunner is very interesting compared to a lot of other card games that has this like click-based action economy. The idea as a runner, you have 4 clicks, you have 4 different actions you can do. And so if you plot out a graph, if you plot out a tree of all the possibilities of what you can do on your turn, it's massive. And as much as possible, you want to find the right path down that, the best path you can. And so one thing that I want to really emphasize, the best thing you can do on your turn, if you figured out what you want to do on your turn, say it's, I want to install this card. Say I want to fix this problem. I want to put ice on this server. I want to jam this thing into a remote server. That's good. Let's keep that as a goalpost of which direction we want to go. But before we do any clicks, try and figure out what you want to do with the rest of your turn first. Because one of the best things you can do is give yourself as many options as possible before you commit to any options. So the idea, while you might be quick to like just jam something on the end of the table, what about if we spend our turn drawing into more options before committing to something? Let me give you an example. Say, for instance, we're a runner and we started the game, in fact, this is turn 1 with a daily cast in hand, and we think daily cast is a really good resource. We put this down now, it's going to pay us off across the next 4 turns. So that is our goalpost this turn. Click 1, we install the daily cast on the table. We nailed it. Now we have 3 more clicks to do. We'll figure out what they are. Click 2, let's draw a card. I guess we need to draw cards, and we draw into a sure gamble. And now this is really awkward. We have only 2 credits to our name. It's going to be a couple turns before we get sure gamble credits off the daily casts. And now we have a really awkward situation where we've drawn an unplayable card that we would have loved to play on turn 1. And this is where you see what I mean, where you want to plan any of your clicks before you spend any of your clicks. We planned that we want to play daily casts, but there was no reason for us to play this click 1. We could have played this click 4 and it makes very little difference. This card doesn't do anything throughout the turn. It just needs to be there before our next turn starts. So say we plan our turn and say, okay, we want to install daily casts, but we can do that last click. So what do we do with our first 3 clicks? And so we think, okay, maybe we should draw once. And so we draw into our sure gamble. Fantastic. We're already a lot better. We can play the sure gamble and then play the daily cast, and we'll be a lot more liquid, or we're going to have a lot more flexible options going forward. But now you might think, okay, great, click 2, I'll play the sure gamble, but that's exactly still not the point that we want to do here. While we could play the sure gamble for click 2, we still might want to continue thinking, okay, if I play the gamble sure click 2, what am I doing for click 3? And if that answer is something like draw, you probably want to still draw before you play the sure gamble, because you might find something nicer. So our turn possibly went from something like play daily cast, draw into a sure gamble you can't play, have a really awkward opening turn, to something like perhaps, I don't know, draw once, play a sure gamble, click for a credit, play the daily cast. Perhaps even if we exactly did what we think we're going to do, which is plan our whole turn, maybe on that turn instead we drew for a click, we draw a sure gamble, then we think, okay, I'm going to draw again, and then we drew into something like an Earthrise Hotel. And now our turn is radically different from where we thought we would start, just because we spent the beginning of our turn planning our clicks and getting to as many options as we can before we start committing to options. So the idea here now is for a 3rd and 4th click, we could consider doing something like sure gamble. And instead of installing the daily cast, we install the Earthrise Hotel. We'll save the daily cast for next turn, and then we don't have to worry about draw for the next couple of turns, and our economy is still pretty good. The range in turns that we could have played turn 1 from that click 1 daily cast to the sure gamble to Earthrise Hotel, that is such a different game that you're going to have. And the only difference between your play is that you tried to plan your turn before you started committing to anything. It is such a big difference in this scenario, right? The difference between starting with an Earthrise Hotel and 5 credits and between, you know, your daily cast and an awkward hand. It's just, you're just gonna have such a big different turn. And that's what I mean when planning your clicks before spending any of your clicks. On the corp side, I think this actually happens a heck of a lot. And it's something I call out on myself and also our opponents a fair bit on stream. Let's say imaginarily we're playing the corporation. The runner has slapped down a conduit on the table, and now we think, uh-oh, we need to ice up R&D in our turn because that tithe we put there on turn 1 is just not going to hold out against that conduit. So we look at our hand when our turn starts and we see a shiny palisade there. That's a piece of ice. Slap it on R&D. We're good. That was click 1. But now we have 2 more clicks left in our turn, and we think, okay, well, we didn't plan these out. What are we going to do? So click 2, we draw. And we top deck a Karuna. A piece of ice that's actually better suited to be put in front of R&D because it's more taxing for the runner to run through multiple times so that the conduit is a lot slower as opposed to the palisade, which is not going to hold up for that much longer. Once they get their fractor, they generally get through this for 1 credit. And it's a very good example. It's a very clear example at the corporation with only 3 clicks. It's a lot easier sometimes to plan your turn, but you want to be drawing before you commit. You can see this a lot of times. People might install an ice, 2nd click draw. That is almost always wrong in this game. You always want to be drawing first, give yourself the most options so you can make the best decision. Draw before you commit to anything. Plan your clicks before you spend your clicks. Another very good example. Maybe you have a remote server that's iced. The runner can't get into it. So you think, oh, I'm going to put my Nico campaign in there first click. And then 2nd and 3rd click, you realize, oh, I don't really know what I'm doing. I guess click 2, I'll draw. And then you draw into an agenda. And that agenda could have gone into the remote server and you could have even advanced it. If instead, click 1 you drew, and then you looked at all the options you had, which was either Nico or Offworld, and then you commit to the better option. This is such a big deal. The difference between getting that Nico campaign on the table or scoring an Offworld office on turn 2 is a huge change in the game. So again, this is such an important rule, and I'd highly recommend if you're new to this game to spend the next couple of games with only this thought in mind. I'm going to try as much as possible to plan my turns before I start doing any of my turns because you're much more likely to be able to get to the best option every turn. And big part of that is to give yourself as many options before you commit to any options. Now, there is a caveat here. As the runner specifically, that can get a bit more nuanced because for the runner, you're often dealing with incomplete information. A lot of times, sometimes you might want to click 1, run R&D, run HQ, get a bit of information. Say click 1, the runner runs R&D and sees something like a public trail on the top of the deck. Now they also have the next 3 clicks to maybe interact with the knowledge that they've gained. So sometimes also just running kind of takes the same place as drawing cards. It gives you a bit more information on what you can work with your turn. So keep that in mind as well. But that is tip 1, and it's a very important tip. It's such an easy thing to iron out. With just a bit of patience, this becomes second nature. Before you get excited about strapping down your sure gamble, your daily cast, try and figure out what you're going to do for the rest of your turn before you commit to any part of your turn. Cool. Now, tip 2 is also a very important tip to figure out to play better on a turn-by-turn basis. And this is figuring out how your deck is going to win the game and also figure out how your deck is going to lose the game. Now, this actually can be a bit of a difficult thing. And when I'm saying this, I don't mean to talk about specific card knowledge. It is really important once you start playing at, say, standard in a standard format, the bigger competitive format, is that there are going to be certain cards which are meta cards that you have to play around. The idea is that if you're sitting down against an NBN deck, you know they might have hard-hitting news, and then there's ways to interact with that. I don't mean that at all when I say figure out how you're going to win and figure out how you're going to lose. We'll keep it on a very simple level. Figure out what your deck does and how your deck is going to get to that 7 points on the runner or on the corpse side. So let's talk about a shaper deck. Let's say that we're playing a shaper deck within System Gateway or within the startup format. And if you ask me, how would I define my game plan? I'm going to define my game plan into 4 simple steps. Firstly, as my shaper deck, I'm going to get some economy. I'm going to play econ cards, get enough economy so I can start installing cards and then using those cards. So step 2, get my breakers down on the table. You got your breakers, you got to install them, and then you need enough money to be able to use these. Now, step 3, check the remote server. This is where the corporation is very likely to put their agendas to score them out. So if I can easily get my breakers down and be able to check the remote server and the corporation doesn't feel safe, I'll make sure they're not scoring agendas and they might be in a pretty hard situation. And then the final step, step 4, my deck will put down a conduit, a very strong R&D multi-access card, and then eventually once the remote server is under control and I feel comfortable getting into it, I'll be able to close the game in R&D, put on an amount of pressure that builds and builds and builds until I get to 7 points. And that actually describes a lot of decks within System Gateway, within Startup, even within Standard, that this 4-stage plan: get economy, get breakers, check the remote server, and then eventually have some sort of central pressure win condition. That's a pretty tried and true strategy for winning the game in Netrunner. And why I'm saying this is it's important to know that this is the game plan of perhaps your deck, because you need to be aware when you're diverting from this game plan, because as much as possible, all the decisions that you want to make should be pushing you in this direction. I see this a lot with newer players. Say for instance, this is the same deck we're playing, but then you realize on turn 4 or turn 5, there's maybe an on-sell res on R&D. And that is a killer, or sorry, it's a sentry that you can break with because you have your killer installed. So you think, okay, wait, I can get through this ice. So I'm going to install my echelon and I'm going to pay 6 credits to break the on-sell to get a single access off the top of R&D. We're going way off script here. This is probably really bad for you. Firstly, paying 6 credits to get a single access, that is just probably unsustainable. It is worth noting, and this probably should be a tip on its own. On average, you need about, what's the number, like 17 accesses to have a good chance at winning the game. Is that number correct? I'll correct it if it's not at this point. But the idea is that like spending 6 credits for a single access is just a not sustainable trade. But I think more importantly, the point I wanted to hammer home here is that spending the time and 6 credits to get a single access of R&D is not time and credits we're spending building towards the win condition that our deck is set up to do. This is not us checking the remote server, having enough money to make sure we can check the remote server when we need to. This is not us having the money to get down our conduit to ensure our runs in R&D are much more valuable than a single access. This is us spending a lot of time and a lot of credits just seeing something that we could do and pursuing it because it was an option. It was not the best option, but it was an option, so we went for it. And this is the point that I want to hammer home. Figure out how your deck wants to win the game and try and make sure as much as possible the things you are doing are pushing you in that right direction. 6 credits for an access off of R&D is not the right direction. Now, admittedly, we'll get to this, but there are some caveats where you do have to kind of get off script and go for these like really panicked answers. But for most part, as much as possible, you want to see how you can get there. On the corp side, I feel like a lot of times figuring out how you're going to win, a lot of times the corp decks are a bit better at pushing you in the right direction. Say, for instance, your deck is running a lot of 5-3 agendas, you're going to have a lot of money and you have punitive counterstrike. So if the runner steals a 5-3 agenda, you can land 2 punitive counterstrike traces and do 6 meat damage. I think corp decks will generally push you in the right direction more often. It's a lot harder to like really do something that's off script as opposed to a runner where you have a lot more avenues of attack. And it's on you to figure out what the proper avenue is. And again, try and figure out what your deck wants to do and build in that direction. Now, equally, we talked about it's important to know how your deck is going to win, but it's also important to know how your deck can lose, or specifically how your opponent can beat you. And admittedly, there's a bit of card understanding here. I'm not going to dive deep into this, but we'll just take one simple example here. This is Restoring Humanity from System Gateway, and if I'm playing against this deck, I'm pretty sure that this deck is going to be running 2 or 3 copies of Anoetic Void, one of the strongest defensive upgrades for a remote server in the whole game. If they get an Anoetic Void behind 2 or 3 pieces of ice, it's very hard for my deck to contest that remote server and steal agendas from it. So step 3 out of my 4-step plan of charging the remote server might be very, very difficult. So just seeing how my deck might struggle in this matchup, you might just want to change your plan a bit. And instead of going from step 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, maybe you go from 1 to 2 straight to 4. 4 is get that conduit down, hammer R&D, because they can't protect R&D that well if they're protecting the remote server very well. And if they can't draw on agendas because we're stealing all of them with conduit, their Anoetic Void server is useless. That's what I mean. Figuring out a bit about how the corp can beat you, figure out what your deck is weak against. This will come with more time. I'm apologies. It's going to be hard to put all this in a video to understand against what matchups, what they can do well. This will come with time, I promise you. But figuring out what they can do well should affect your game plan a wee bit, or maybe a lot, in fact. But that's tip number 2. Figure out a general idea of how your deck wants to win and make sure you're trying to stick to that script, because spending a lot of time and money doing the thing that your deck doesn't want to do probably could be time and money spent a bit better. Same for figuring out how you're going to lose. Make sure you can kind of fight against that to some extent. Now, tip 3 is actually a bit, man, it feels a bit backwards after tip 2, where we're trying to say, stick to the script, figuring out what you want to do. But tip 3 is don't play your deck, play the matchup. And this is something I also very often see when playing on stream, is maybe sometimes newer players will have a deck and they'll stick to playing their deck the exact way that their deck is built, even though that might not be the right thing in the matchup. This kind of dovetails well off of the play to your weakness as well. So let's talk specifically about speed and tempo when it comes to this game. This is a Wayland Consortium built to last. It's from System Gateway, and this deck can actually be pretty quick. This is the sort of deck that built a certain way could try and win the game on turn 10 as a corp. Now, if you compare that to something like Hasbiroid's Architects of Tomorrow, this is a much slower deck usually. This is a deck that wants to spend a lot of time installing a lot of Biroids, resing a lot of the Biroids for very cheaply, and then try and win out maybe by turn 20, turn 22, 25, take a while to get there. And you need to understand that these sort of decks, you're going to have to play very differently against them based off the speed that they want to close the game. Same thing goes as a corporation. This is a Zaya. Zaya is a very quick runner, potentially a small deck size. She's pretty consistent, and her accesses give her more money, which keeps her going and getting more accesses. Compare that to something like Sunny LeBeau, one of the mini factions, who has a bigger deck size, is less consistent, and often relies on some of the bigger, more expensive installs to get up to speed. So based off this knowledge, you need to evaluate the cards in your deck and see which ones work for the matchup and which don't. This is a Smartware Distributor from System Gateway. On its own, it's a card that's actually very click intensive, but over a long enough period of time is actually a very, very good way of generating economy. Again, over a long period of time. Now compare that to a card like Sure Gamble, which is a very simple 1-click for 4 credits. Technically, in a lot of cases, Smartware Distributor can be the better econ card. But again, only in the case that you have enough time to get there. But say I'm playing a matchup as a runner and the corporation is a precision design deck that seems to be jamming agendas behind ice every turn, every 2 turns, scoring it out with seamless launch. If that is the case, that's what the matchup looks like, and I have 3 Smartware Distributors in my deck, even though they're in my deck, I'm not going to play them. Because I understand if I draw this on turn 4 or turn 5 and I spend 2 clicks to set this up, it's probably not going to be paying out that well before the game is over. I think a very good example of this is perhaps this deck. This is Sneaky Tau. It's a deck that Close to La Roche uploaded. And this is a good example of something that's specifically very Shaper. This shows up on a lot of Shaper cards. Shaper cards, they have a lot of cards like this that are very expensive and provide an immense amount of value over a long enough period of time. Professional Contacts costs 5. That's a very expensive card, but its ability spend a click to gain a card and a credit, that pays off immensely if you can use this maybe 15 times in a game. Compare that to other cards like that. DZMZ Optimizer is a really good card that gives you a rebate on installing programs every turn, let alone an MU. But to get the most value out of this, you need to install a lot of cards and the game needs to last a lot of turns. Same thing for the very simple Rizeki. Installing this for 2 credits gives you a credit at the beginning of every single turn, but it'll take about 5 turns before this pays off in a very meaningfully credit positive way. Now, say I'm playing against that Hasbiroid Precision Design deck that wants to close the game on turn 10. If I'm looking at this deck and I draw into my Professional Contacts on turn 3 even, should I play it? And a lot of times the answer is no. Should I play my DZMZ Optimizer? Even the second one that I've drawn on turn 4? Probably not. Should I play my Rizeki on turn 6? Probably not. And this is something that I sometimes see newer players struggle with where they have a deck. And this is by far like quite a good deck. I don't think any of these cards are bad choices for the deck, but I think what's really important, again, is the exact tip here is don't play exactly your deck, but play the matchup. And you need to be a bit discerning. There are some cards in your deck that are going to be better in certain matchups and worse in certain matchups, not only based off of what the corporation is doing, but the speed that they're working at. I think the speed thing is just a good enough way to evaluate a lot of cards. And that's one of the good things about this game. One of my favorite things about this game. If you have a hand of cards and none of these cards are good for the matchup, might not pay off well enough for the matchup, you don't have to play them. You can always spend a click to draw a card. Heck, if you have Diesel, spend a click to draw 3 cards. That's what I really like about this game. If your hand doesn't make sense for the circumstance you're in, get a better hand. And that might be a struggle. A lot of players might pick up the deck and might be used to other games where you think, okay, this deck is built like this way, so I need to play the deck to win. But again, you need to be flexible and make sure you're not sticking to every card in your deck because they won't work in every situation. If a corporation is scoring out agendas from hand on turn 2, let alone turn 1 with Audacity, I don't think your second or even your first DZMZ Optimizer might be worth the click, let alone the 2 credits. So do keep that in mind. Make sure you're not sticking to your deck stubbornly because the cards were in the deck, but try and play your matchup and be a bit more discerning. I think a really good way of looking at it is tech cards. This is called No One Home. It's a very easy card to include in your deck. It costs 0 to install. It's only 1 influence. And this card doesn't do anything outside of lets you deal with tags and net damage. And a lot of times people will refer this as a tech card or a silver bullet card. And it's the sort of card that in some matchups, in most matchups perhaps even, it does nothing. But in certain matchups, it's so valuable because the tags and net damage are very meaningful. And a lot of people will be fine with this sort of idea. They drew their tech card and they understand this is not a matchup in which this matters. I'm just not going to play it. And what I'm trying to say here is try and keep that sort of like discerning mentality when it comes to every single card in your deck. It's easy for no one home because it does nothing in a lot of scenarios, but consider that when you see your Rizeki on turn 5 in a very fast game. This card will actually do less than nothing in some cases if you're installing it for 2 and it's only giving you 2 credits before the game is over. You're better off spending that click doing anything else. So that's tip number 3. Don't play your deck. Play the matchup and be discerning. Not everything works in the matchup. Tip 4 is actually a question. The question is, where are the agendas? Now, this is a really important question. It's actually sometimes the most important question. Generally, both corporations and runners care about this a lot. Most runner games will end when the runner scores at least 7 points of agendas. So understanding where the agendas are is probably one of the most important things you can do in the matchup. So let's look at some numbers. And I'm saying this as a basic heuristic so you can start making intelligent decisions on understanding what running different servers is worth at any point in time. So this is restoring humanity once again. It's one of the identities like in System Gateway. And like all the corporation identities in System Gateway, it's a 40 minimum deck size deck. You have to have at least 40 cards. And so when you're playing, when you're building a corporation deck, if your deck is 40 to 44 cards, you need to include the same amount of agendas, 18 to 19 agendas. So a lot of times for a 40 minimum card deck, a lot of players will play 44 cards just so that there's more non-agenda cards per agenda card that they have to play in their deck, right? Like the density is a bit lower of agendas to non-agendas. They'll play those 4 extra cards. Now, if you look at the math here, with 44 cards in the deck, and in this deck specifically, this is Crit's deck, there's 8 agendas. That comes down to that there's 1 agenda in 5.5 cards. So let's just abstract that away to 1 in 6 cards. So you have to remember when playing against this deck, 1 in every 6 cards that the corp draws should be an agenda. Now, if you go over to bigger deck sizes, this is Paulina Foods, and actually it's much more common that corporation decks have a 45 minimum deck size. So a lot of people will play 49 cards because you still have to play 20 to 21 agendas and 45 to 49 cards, excuse me. This deck is running 9 agendas. And again, while we said 8 and 9 agendas, that number can fluctuate all the way from like 6 to 12 agendas in each deck. On average, what I'm trying to say here is 9 agendas and 49 cards. That comes down to the same average number. It's about 1 in every 6 cards is an agenda. And again, why I'm saying this is that number is really important to understand as an heuristic to try and make educated decisions about when to run and what's the probability, the likeliness of finding an agenda at any point in time of the game. When the game starts, the corporation draws 5 cards and they can choose to mulligan. A lot of times if I'm holding a hand with multiple agendas, no economy, not a lot of ice, I'll mulligan my hand. And so then I start with 5 cards with no control over that. Mandatory draw, I draw my 6th card. And 6 is the magic number because what we've said is on average in a 6-card hand after the corporation mandatory draws, especially when they mulligan to some extent, they will probably have 1 agenda in there. Does that mean you should slam HQ on turn 1? Not always, but it's something that's important to keep in mind, that you can track how many cards the corporation draws and divide that number by 6. And that should be, to some extent, the probability of how many agendas are in the game right now. Of course, you have to subtract the ones scored, but there should be some agendas in HQ. And keep that in mind, specifically when the corporation draws a lot of cards. If they play predictive planogram on turn 2, and by the end of turn 3, they've drawn through 12 cards of their deck, there's probably 2 agendas in HQ. Cards like Rashida Yahim are so popular within the standard card pool. This is beginning of turn, draw 3 cards, gain 3 credits, and mandatory draw. That means they've just drawn 4 cards before this turn starts. That's important for 2 reasons. Firstly, if the corporation draws a lot, there's a chance there's more likely to be more agendas in hand, so HQ pressure is more valuable. But again, just do the math. If they've drawn 12 cards, probably 2 agendas in hand. One thing that's actually really useful about playing on Jinteki.net is Jinteki.net at any point in time will tell you how many cards are left in R&D. So if you subtract the amount of cards that the corporation deck started with, you can kind of get an idea of how many agendas should be within HQ and maybe even on the table, and use it to make decisions. Should I jailbreak now because the corporation just drew into Rashida on turn 3 after scoring no agendas? Yeah, probably. You might even find 2 agendas. You're not unlikely to, you're more than likely in some cases to always find 1 agenda. I shouldn't say probabilities and always in the same sentence. That doesn't make any sense, but you know what I mean. Keep track of how often the corp draws and just keep in mind, if they've drawn 6 cards in a row and they haven't scored an agenda out, there's probably an agenda in there. Now this does get a bit more tricky. System Gateway specifically added a couple cards that allow you shuffle the cards from HQ or from archives back into R&D. Things like Sprint, and things like Spin Doctor. And it's important to keep that in mind because a lot of times these cards will be used to bury agendas, specifically in the early game, and put them back into R&D. So make sure that you are keeping track if these cards are being fired. The 1 in 6 rule in HQ will fall apart to some extent. So it can't be a strong rule, but it's worth keeping in mind to a pretty big extent still. That being said, if the corporation is sprinting and spin doctoring and you have a suspicion they're putting agendas from HQ into R&D, that means actually the density of agendas in R&D is higher than 1 in 6 by the mid game. If all the agendas have been added back into R&D, jailbreaking R&D honestly sounds a bit better. It might be closer to 1 in 5, 1 in 4 in some extreme cases. So do keep that in mind. Another thing that's also worth noting is you can always count the agenda points in the game. If the corporation is playing a 44 card deck, that means they have 18 to 19 agenda points. So you can look at your score area, you can look at the corporation score area, and have a pretty good idea of how many agendas are still in the game by just doing some math, saying like, okay, there are mostly 2-pointers. So if there's, 8 out of the game already, there's, 12 still left in the game. I did the math wrong on that, 10. So do keep that in mind. Another thing, where the agendas are is also important to understand where the agendas aren't. Say the corporation has a remote server with some good ice on it. We have a Brawn res, we have some other big ice. And in their remote server, again, they have that dreaded Anoetic Void, one of the best defensive upgrades in the whole game. Now, the corporation has a remote server that the runner by no means can get into. So if they had an agenda, they would jam it into that remote server. And now the corporation starts their turn. They have 5 cards in hand, they mandatory draw. Click 1, they draw. Click 2, they draw. Click 3, they click for a credit. Now it's back to it's your turn as the runner. And you think, okay, well, they drew a lot, so I'm going to go ahead and legwork them and find an agenda. But this is the point that I'd argue, is that I think if the corporation drew an agenda at this point in the game, because they have a remote server that's so secure, even if they couldn't score the agenda the next turn, they're probably very likely to just put that agenda in the remote server regardless. So I would argue that this legwork is probably not worth it, because it doesn't look like the corporation has an agenda, because if they did, it would not keep it in hand. And that's a good reason. Maybe if the legwork looks nice, because there's only 1 ice on HQ and you're going to see 3 cards, fantastic. But I'd argue that a legwork is very likely to fail. If you compare that to having a Maker's Eye in the same hand, where you have to go to 2 or 3 pieces of ice on R&D, this Maker's Eye has such a better chance of stealing agendas, because while it might be more expensive to make the run, there's probably way more agendas in R&D, because right now the corporation drew a lot of cards and didn't find any. Again, on average, 1 in 6. So that's a basic idea that you should always keep in mind when you're playing Netrunner. Where are the agendas? Because again, you're trying to steal 7. So if the corporation is drawing a lot, that can draw heat. If they're shuffling agendas back into R&D, do keep that in mind. Otherwise, 1 in 6 is a good rule. And if the corporation looks like they could be scoring agendas, but they aren't, that means they probably don't have any. So R&D is probably where it's at. Again, another big thing about Maker's Eye, again, if you see the top 3 cards of the deck and you steal any agendas, that means the corporation is probably not going to be drawing into agendas next turn. And you don't have to worry about that Anoetic Void server again. So there's also some good reasons to be running R&D in that situation. Okay, we're on to tip 5. Tip 5 is very simple. It is just the word run. And I mean it. Run a lot. Run more than you're used to. I know it's pretty intimidating when you start this game. You start the game as a runner. You have no programs. The corporation's putting ice down on the table. It's unrezzed. It could be anything. It could hurt you. It could trash your cards. You don't want to run into it until you get your breakers. But what I'm going to encourage, specifically as a newer player, if you're playing System Gateway, if you're moving on to Startup, is just start running, and specifically more than you think you're comfortable with. Go out of your comfort zone, start running. One of my favorite identities to teach players back in the day was Gabriel Santiago, because Gabriel Santiago said when you run HQ, first time a turn, gain 2 credits. And it gave a lot of runners a very good idea of what they want to do every turn, is click 1, turn 1, run HQ. Now, Zaya is the closest thing we have to Gabe, and by far a pretty good option, but this is what I think you should be doing in every game, is just as much as possible, get your thing down that rewards you from running and just start running. Say you're playing Gabriel Santiago. You put down your penny shaver, whatever. Click 2, click 1, you run HQ, and the corporation reses a palisade on HQ. So basically, imagine on that basic action card, the card you have that says all the basic actions you can do for your clicks, there was one at the bottom that says spend a click, gain 3 credit. Spend a click, force the corp to lose 3 credits, find out what ice they have. You'd probably be hitting that button a lot. That sounds like a really good button. And that's exactly what you did there. You spent a click, the corporation lost 3 credits. You now have full information of what you need to install, what breaker you need to install to finally get into HQ. That was a really good trade for you. And I'm aware that I've kind of cherry picked the scenario that Palisade doesn't have a face check. It doesn't do anything bad to the runner. That's what we call a face check generally. If it just like did net damage or made you lose credits, that would feel a bit worse. But at the end of the day, just finding out what their ice is and forcing the corporation to spend money is one of the best things you can do. And that's why I would highly recommend you just to start running and forcing the corporation to be off, just a bit off balance. Keep pushing at them so they never feel comfortable and that you're forced to spend money. And forcing them to spend money is so important in this game. All the economy cards, almost all the economy cards in this game cost money. Hedge fund costs 5 credits. So if you're forcing the corp to spend money to go to low credit counts, a lot of times their next turn is simply just click for credits so they can get up to that hedge fund level so they can get out of that hole. And if the runner's clicking for credits, they're probably not going to be winning the game anytime soon. Let alone look at government subsidy. You need 10 credits to play this. So if the corporation is sitting on 7, 8 credits, they probably don't want to res ice. And it's in your best interest to force them to make them feel like they need to so they can't play that sweet click for 5 credit card. Other options cards like Biotic Labor, this means they can score agendas out of hand for 7 credits. That's a lot of money. And if they never feel comfortable, never feel like they can afford that because you're being so aggressive, that's going to slow them down. And then the agendas are going to crop up in HQ and you're going to have a good time running HQ. Specifically, again, play Gabriel Santiago. Again, there's a fair bit of ice, like force them to spend credits. Again, I'm talking about startup here or system gateway, things like Funhouse. Pay 5 to end the run, fine. Pay 6 to end the one with Braun. Maybe you'll click through the first subroutine. That's all good. Now, admittedly, once you get to the bigger card pool, the ice does get a bit meaner to some extent, but I still think this rule stands tall. Anansi is a really, really mean face check. There's some really strong subroutines on this ice, but a lot of times the right play still is make the corporation spend 8 credits. Even if all these horrible things happen and these beautiful subroutines happen, still making them spend 8 credits is really important on a lot of board states because there's only so much money. And there's only so much time. 8 credits is a lot of money. So again, do start running. Another really nice thing, and this is a good segue to our next tip, tip 6, is a lot of times their ice have subroutines that only matter on certain board states. If you ever run into a ballista and they have to spend 5 credits and they don't end up trashing an installed program, they just end up ending the run. And now you know where the ballista is, so you'll never be scared of it. That's so good for you. So again, keep running. Now, tip 6 though, is don't show your hand until you need to. While this is applicable still to the corporation, I'm going to talk about this specifically for the runner. As the runner, you don't have too much hidden information. The corporation is the person playing with all the hidden information. All their ice is going to be installed face down. What's in the remote server? Is it an asset? Is it an ambush? Is it an agenda? There's so much that if you knew what everything was, if you had perfect information of the board state, the game would be so much easier and you'd be making better decisions more consistently. And that's why obfuscating as much as you can to give as little information to your opponent so they can make worse decisions more regularly is so important to you. Means as a runner, as little as possible should you be showing what you have. And I've seen this a fair bit, is that a lot of times runners will click 1 sometime in the early turn, install a program. They'll install an icebreaker. They just install their Unity, they get it down on the table and they think, okay, I have my Unity installed. So now we'll start running. So now that if I hit a code gate, I'll be able to break it and a bad thing won't happen to me. And I would say that's actually a really bad thing to do. Because the only hidden information you have as a runner is what's in your hand. And as soon as you show what you're capable of, it entirely changes the play space, that the corporation knows what you are capable of and what you're not capable of. The early game is actually so volatile to some extent. A corporation often will try and score an agenda in the early game behind a single ice or 2 ice just to, before they think that you have what you need in your hand to contest it. And as soon as you dumped your Unity on the table, the corporation knows they can't try and score an agenda behind a diviner. Like this seems like a really bad call, let alone maybe something like an Enigma. That's probably more likely because it consistently ends the run. The idea is the corporation now knows like my Enigma play is not a good idea. Sometimes they won't even res some of their ice. Like I won't be tempted to pay 2 credits to res the diviner when I know you have a Unity that breaks it for like 1 credit. Wait, actually, is it 1 or is it 2? Oh, never mind. It's a bit better than that. 2 credits. But that's what I mean. Not only is that really bad for face checking things that can trash programs, but as soon as they know that you have something, as soon as you put your cleaver on the table, they know their remote server is not safe for Palisade. You are basically giving them the ability not to goof up and push their luck and try and score behind a barrier that you had the option to install cleaver, run the remote server. So try and keep as much as you can as a surprise, because as soon as the corporation knows what you're capable of, that helps them a heck of a lot. So do watch out. Now, our 7th and final tip, I think this is a funny one. but this is corporate shuffle. I'm actually really excited about this because this year is going to be the first time that a lot of us are going to be playing Netrunner in person, at least for a long time since. I played very little Netrunner in person last year. But this is a really important tip when it comes to playing Netrunner in person. Because physical cards, it's going to be pretty intimidating if you've been playing Netrunner only on Jinteki.net to start playing in person for a while. But here's my tip. Okay, say you're playing as a corporation and the runner has ran R&D and they see the top card of R&D and they haven't stolen an agenda, they haven't trashed it. So they know exactly what the card is. Let's just say it's a piece of ice. Now, a lot of corporations, they'll be sitting here with the card, 5-hand, mandatory draw. They'll take the card off the top of their deck and they'll add it to their hand. And now hopefully at this point, they're planning their turn. They're figuring out, okay, I'm going to plan all my clicks before spending all my clicks, how I'm going to lose, they're doing all that good stuff. And then they decide, okay, I'm going to do credit, and I'm going to take this card and install it on our remote server as a piece of ice. So you might have noticed the problem here is that I took a card from R&D, I put it in my hand, I thought a while, and then I took that, obviously the same card, and put it on the table. And the runner knows what this card is because they saw you draw it off the top of your deck after they ran R&D. This might be surprising, but this is actually a really common thing that I see with newer players. And like, I'm not trying to blame anyone here. A lot of times there's a lot going on in Netrunner. You have to think about what you're doing. You want to plan your turn. There's a lot going on. And so this idea of like figuring out what's in your hand, or sometimes that's lost. Some players won't even pick up on this because they're too busy staring at their board state to realize that their opponent isn't really doing any hand manipulation. You should watch your opponent a bit more if you can. You can learn a lot from it. So what I recommend you to do, and I do this anytime I draw, and I do this multiple times between a turn, is when you draw your card, mandatory draw, you put your card in your hand. Before you do anything, just shuffle your hand a wee bit. And now the runner still might guess that if you install an ice, it's the ice from the top of the deck, but they won't know. And that's so important. Now, admittedly, some people have like sleight of hand stuff. Well, it looks like they pulled a card, but then pull a different card, whatever. If you want to think you can do that, I actually hope you can. That'd be pretty fun. But as much as possible, I'm just about always shuffling my hand. A lot of times I'll even draw the top card from mandatory and I'll put it on top of my deck without looking at it, and then shuffle and then look at it. I promise you this is really important. As much as possible, just shuffle your hand. You don't need to do this on Jinteki.net because you can't see where the card came from, but in person, it is really important. This is not something you should take for granted. On top of that, 2 other things about playing physical cards in person. It's worth knowing that humans are classically really bad at randomizing things. You think you're good at randomizing, you're not. So say, for example, you're running HQ for a single axis. Maybe the corporation will hold their cards like this. A lot of times I'll put my cards face down on the table and then they'll pick a card and they'll do it randomly. They'll maybe grab one from the middle and then later on grab one from the left in another turn, whatever. The problem is with this is a lot of times humans are actually not as random as they think they are. So some players have the opportunity to play you and realize like, oh, they never pick this card or they never pick this card, and maybe put agendas there on purpose before they give you the hand of 5 cards for you to choose the agenda. That's a bummer. We'll admit, I guess that's a bummer. But what I'd recommend in all situations is that if you're random accessing from from HQ, just bring a nice die, roll a d6, and then map it out. So this is maybe 1, the other side's 5, 6 is free parking, roll again, and then randomize it fully. So the corporation can't play you. Your random is fully random. Unfortunately, if you feel like you have the heart of the cards and you could pull the right card, if you just believed in yourself and not the die, you're going to have to kind of come to peace with that idea, but it is worth knowing. Same thing for the corporation. Anytime before I give the runner the option to access from HQ, I'll always shuffle my hand before offering them, just so that everything is always nice and scrambled. Again, when transitioning to play in person, these are things that can easily fall by the side, but these sort of things are definitely very important and have a huge difference if somebody can clearly read what you're playing just because you don't shuffle your hand. I guess on top of that, you can also shuffle cards that are face down in archives when the runner runs archives, so they don't know when you threw them out, but that's like real edge gains if you're getting really sweaty about this. But that's 7 tips. So again, just to go everything to make sure we're on the same page, tip 1 is simply plan your turn. Don't spend any clicks until you planned out all of your clicks, or as much as you can. Again, there's a huge web of options. Give yourself as many options within the turn before you commit to anything. That's generally a very good thing. That's actually a very important thing to follow. Second, figure out how you're going to win the matchup and figure out how you're going to lose the matchup, and try and stick to the plan and try and, reroute the other plan. Make sure you've figured out what your weaknesses are. Third, don't play the matchup. Play the matchup, not your deck. Not every card in your deck will work in every situation, and it's very important to understand that and be a bit discerning with every card that you could decide to play. Tip 4, Where are the agendas? Our basic rule is 1 in 6 is an agenda. So make sure if the corporation is drawing a lot, you got some good ideas of what the value of running HQ is. If they're shuffling cards away in R&D, if they could have had an agenda and jammed it, would they? Then maybe don't run HQ. It's a very important game to play. 5th, if I'm not mistaken, is run more. Just try running. Specifically, if you're playing startup and standard, be aggressive, more aggressive than you think. This is not a game about getting the right solutions. A lot of times this is a game just about running with your face. And a lot of times that works out really well for you. Tip 6, don't show your hand until you need to. Again, no reason to put down your programs turn 1. You're going to give so much information to the corporation, and turn 7, just keep shuffling. Honestly, I love shuffling. I'm one of those guys who's constantly shuffling through the whole game. Really annoying. Big fan. Do it as much as you can. Well, that's 7 tips that we have today. Again, if there's any tips or any things that you'd like to pass on, maybe to newer players, any things that really helped you grow as a Netrunner player, I'd love to hear those comments within the comment section. We'll respond to as much as we can. If you think there's something I misstepped on or something that's not totally right, again, let me know as much as possible. I want to make this a resource to help people get into this game and be a bit more competitive, hopefully. On top of that, there's like a lot of better resources to get better at the game. There's a couple Discord channels. I'm not particularly affiliated with them, but we have Green Level Clearance, which is a really nice place for newer players. And we have Itinerant Protesters, which is a fantastic spot for players to go to specifically push themselves into a more competitive kind of direction. I'll leave the links to both those Discord groups within the comments below in the description of the video. On top of that, if you like this video, a like and subscribe does help the channel grow, but we'll be streaming, as we always do, on Thursdays at 8:45 Eastern. And specifically this week on July the 23rd, we'll have a competitive tournament. We're streaming the last leg of it on Friday, starting at 3 Eastern. So if you want to join in for that, that'd be great. That's largely it. Those are our 7 tips. Hope they help you out. Happy net running. Thanks for watching. Ciao.